It's hard to believe that it's been a full year since the Resident Evil 2 remake was released. A remake that we have begged and demanded for so long, to the point that we thought we would be served with a restraining order from Capcom. Thankfully, that never came to be. This remake meant a lot to me as well, since the first rated M game I ever played was Resident Evil 2 on the Nintendo 64 at the age of 5. Yeah, imagine a 5-year-old playing a survival horror game on the Nintendo 64 in 32-bit 3D polygon. No, oh, I'm sorry, 64-bit 3D polygons. Even though I was really, and I mean really scared to play it, there was just something about it that made me come back for more, with the hope of overcoming that first liquor encounter or trying to survive the infected alligator. I eventually beat the game a year or two later and managed to enjoy a slew of other Resident Evil games, including the remake of the first entry. After this game was released, we immediately thought that a Resident Evil 2 remake would be right around the corner, as another RE title was coming soon, but instead we got Resident Evil 0. It's not a bad game and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't what we were hoping for. It would be revealed years later that Shinji Mikami, one of the main creators of the series, planned to remake Resident Evil 2 much like how he did with the first game, but decided against it as it would have delayed the release date of Resident Evil 4, which development for at the time was already troublesome, as the game underwent a few different builds before settling on the one that converted the series to be action-oriented. So if Mikami-san went ahead with the RE2 remake and delayed Resident Evil 4's release date, not only would Capcom have cancelled RE4, but they would have ultimately grounded the series, killing any hopes for an RE2 remake. So we went through many ridiculous decisions Capcom made with the series before they decided that they did not want to share the same reputation as Konami, and when Resident Evil 7 came out, it was breathtaking, giving me hope that an RE2 remake would arise from this new photorealistic engine, and 2 years later, it finally arrived, and it was everything I could have wanted and more. Even though I would have preferred an optional mode to utilize fixed camera angles, but I'll live with it. However, as much as I enjoy the game, there were a handful of things that I wish could have been either re-altered, added, or tweaked to make it, as Dr. Birkin would describe, as sheer perfection. So with the Resident Evil 3 remake coming soon, I feel now is a good time to discuss what I feel could have been better as far as feeling truly nostalgic to the original game this remake could have been, even though it didn't fail on that front. So I don't know why I even bring that point up. You know what? Point withdrawn. As a heads up, even with what I'm about to gripe about, it won't change how I feel about this game. It's amazing and worth playing, even if you're not into the Resident Evil series yourself. So what I'll be saying is just my opinion and it should not be taken seriously, but even with this direction, others will take it seriously anyways. Don't ask me why, they just do. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. Point 1. Lack of recap prologue. Now immediately you're going to say, wait a second, there's already a prologue with the trucker and his burger, doesn't that count? Well, in this case, not exactly. What I'm referring to is a recap prologue. In the original Resident Evil 2, when you started up the A scenario, you were greeted with a recap video with the narrator catching newcomers up with the events that unfolded in the first game. It was short, but to the point. It gave the right amount of information without getting carried away in its storytelling, an excellent build-up for the mysterious and horrific events that would follow. The developers included this opening because they knew that not a lot of people would have played the first Resident Evil game. In fact, this would actually encourage players to go and try out the first game afterwards. In the remake, however, no such recap exists. In fact, throughout the game, very little retelling of the first game takes place. So if the Resident Evil 2 remake is your first game into the series, you'll be alienated as to what happened that led up to the events plaguing Raccoon City, unless you already played the prequels yourself. I also believe that this could have been very easy to accomplish, as the development team could have used cutscenes from the Resident Evil 1 remake as well as a few scenes from Resident Evil 0 or something to convey the story in a timely manner with an effective narrator driving the retelling. This kind of approach has been accomplished in previous Resident Evil games, such as Resident Evil 4, as it utilized cutscenes from Resident Evil 3. It's also worth noting that in the original RE2, when starting up the B scenario, the narrator recapped the events of the A scenario while introducing the entry point of what happened on the other side. But again, in the remake, no such retelling takes place. Which actually brings me to the next talking point. Point 2. No gameplay or explanation for a second run beginning. To explain what I mean, we have to start with the A scenario as you begin from the crash site, traverse through a slew of street zombies, making it to the police station, encounter some ominous moments before eventually reaching the crash site of the helicopter where you meet with either Leon or Claire, even though canonically speaking, it's Leon you meet up with, and I'm not going to get into how little the two collide with each other throughout the game. Now for the second run, you start out at the other entry point of the police station, meaning a courtyard away from the main entrance. This scene itself to me comes off as abrupt and kind of cheap, as I feel this was a missed opportunity to extend the gameplay given how fast one could beat the second run. With the A scenario, between the time you survive the brush of death with the trucker to the point where you meet up with the other character, for a casual player, that's about a 30 to 45 minute gap, if not nearly an hour exploring half the station. The development team could have taken advantage of such a gap using some unused scenes such as the arc concept of Leon coming upon a devastating crash site of a train as seen in this one, or navigate through a few buildings until eventually making it to the station, or helping out a random citizen until they die in a horrific way. I mean, just anything to fill in that missing gap. Now I know in the original, beginning the B scenario, you were pretty much close to the station, but at least you had to explore a bit to gain access. But in the remake, you're already there just in time for the downed helicopter, which again brings me to the next point. Point 3. How did the helicopter go down? Now with the second run, you would think that the game would reveal exactly how the helicopter went down, but just like in the A scenario, you just hear the helicopter going down and feel the impact of the crash itself. At no point do you actually see the helicopter in the sky taking a free fall. Even at the time of editing this video, no explanation exists. We don't know where the helicopter came from, who it was associated with, or why it was even in Raccoon City airspace. Perhaps someone out there might create a graphic novel detailing that very scene, but my point is, we shouldn't have to do all the assumptions ourselves, since that's all we can do is assume. At least in the original, there was a reason why the helicopter went down. There was a police officer who radioed for help to escape, but ended up being ambushed by a couple of zombies who, because he panicked, couldn't take down the pair with his SMG and gets overwhelmed, leaving his gun firing upwards, accidentally killing the pilot in the chopper. I can only assume that they didn't recreate this scene because in the original, your character was about 30 feet away from this scene unfolding, just standing there doing nothing. That could be forgiven, but at least put something in its place to justify the crash without any contradictions, which once again brings me to the next point. Point 4. Still more contradictions. Now, in case you don't know what a contradiction means, it's basically a statement of a person, a thing, or an event that is completely opposite or inconsistent with what was already detailed. An example being, how could Claire unlock a door in the sewers with a key found in one location and moments later, Leon would find that same key in that same location to unlock that same door you assume would already be unlocked? It's strange because as Claire, I don't remember locking all the doors behind me since I discarded the key as soon as it became useless. How about the puzzle where Claire moved the bookshelves in the library to form a path to the 3rd floor and for it to be reset and have Leon do it as well? Not to mention the same bell in the clock tower falling down twice. These are just a few of the armful of contradictions to be found in the remake. Now to be fair, this isn't the first Resident Evil game in the series to contain contradictions, as earlier titles did have their fair share of them, including the original Resident Evil 2. This was often because they went for different endings, which was a clever way to strengthen the replay value of those games, as opposed to being straightforward, which wouldn't happen until Code Veronica came into the scene. Now that I think about these contradictions, I feel that the remake has more of them than in the original. Many of the same monster encounters, same keys to find and unlock, the same doors, and going through many of the same pathways and the same puzzles somehow reset for the second run, despite traversing different areas at times. Sometimes these same routes would get you something different, like finding the shotgun in the weapons room instead of the grenade launcher, which by the way, how did that happen? One of the most noticeable contradictions I found was with Tyrant, or Mr. X. There's a scene where Claire and Shari are running from Mr. X to get to the elevator, and just when Mr. X was about to give them the works, he's killed in a gruesome fashion by Birkin. Even with that, Mr. X somehow comes back with not a single scratch on him to torment Leon. Do I even need to mention how Mr. X moved away the same wrecked helicopter twice? You could argue that the T-virus has an effect on this type of BOW that allows him to regenerate his cells and tissues, but casual players unfamiliar with the series' lore are not going to know anything about that, especially when they don't find files that detail that exact information, which, by the way, if you can believe that, leads to yet another talking point. Point 5. Lack of compelling files. Now, files have always served a vital purpose to the Resident Evil series. They give you an insight to a lot of perspectives of individuals that have witnessed and encountered horrific events, a huge majority of which never lived to further tell their stories. They also give you an idea of what you might encounter yourself, in addition to giving out clues to puzzles you could be stumped on. What I really enjoy about these files is that no matter the length, they're all very compelling to read and analyze. Now, I'm not saying the Resident Evil 2 remake doesn't contain such files, but I've noticed that a lot of the files in the game have a similar tone in terms of how they project themselves in their writing. I'm probably not explaining this one well enough, but I guess it has something to do with a lot of these files having tons of vulgar terms. Now, I don't mind vulgar language in text for storytelling as long as it isn't redundant or gets overkilled for the sake of it. To be fair, past Resident Evil games did include some vulgar terms in their files, but it wasn't overused as one could tell an effective and terrifying tale without uttering a single curse word, and in some cases, those accounts can be extremely disturbing. I think the overuse of curse words in files started out with Resident Evil 7, and at least that was justified because the Bakers were pretty messed up, despite having bad lip syncing.
Stay the fuck out!
Perhaps I'm analyzing this point too much, and I'm not that bugged out by it, which is more than I can say for the next point. Point 6. Letter from Chris. In the original and remake, the whole reason why Claire arrived in Raccoon City was to find her brother Chris Redfield, a STARS member and one of the main protagonists in the first game. Unbeknownst to her, Chris left Raccoon City and flew off to Europe a month before starting her search. However, unlike in the letter found in the remake, it wasn't for the reason of vacationing, nor any of the other things he allegedly wrote, talking about having a fun time with sexy babes, not allowing old men like Barry to make the pretty girls cry, whatever that means. It's pretty much something Duke Nukem would write, but then again, when was the last time you saw Duke Nukem with a writing utensil in his hands?
Oh man, good plan, Duke. Oh man, that is... I mean, I don't understand any of it, but I bet if I did, that guy over there would still have his arm. And at least one of his balls.
Well, I stand corrected. In all seriousness, I know this letter is a way to cover up Chris's investigation in Umbrella, but even so, I just can't help but feel that this letter portrays Chris as some sort of sexist, immature frat boy, which doesn't truly reflect who he is as a character. Even in later entries like Code Veronica and Resident Evil 5, Chris is always portrayed as mature, cool, and respectful, even though he can have his moments now and again. Now you might ask, well, was a letter like this in the original? No, it wasn't. In fact, there was no letter from Chris. Instead, you found his journal, or rather his diary, which chronicled his frustration with his investigation into the mansion incident and Umbrella being hampered by Chief Irons as he was deep into Umbrella's pockets. It didn't help that tons of incriminating evidence went up in flames with the mansion and with people not cooperating, despite the fact that both Chris and Jill collected a lot of files from that mansion. He also describes more reports of zombies being sighted in the city and attacking citizens, especially in broad daylight, as well as discovering the newly invented G-virus. By the end of the journal, Chris makes the decision to fly to Europe, where Umbrella's main headquarters is located. He knew if he told Claire about it, he would put her in danger, thus ending with the line, "Please forgive me, Claire," which would actually be used in his epilogue in Resident Evil 3 to help tie in with his entry to Code Veronica. Even in Darkside Chronicles, his journal can be found with only a few things being rewritten to be more cohesive. I only wish they could have used this journal in the remake to deliver a very effective and emotional scene for Claire once she found it. I could picture her reading it and fall into her brother's desk chair with some tears while realizing the full grasp of her situation, giving her the motivation to escape Raccoon City with the hope of seeing her brother again. In that same scene, she could also see the fax machine delivering information from FBI agent Jack Hamilton in response to Chris's request, much like what happened in the original. Instead, what we get is this bare bones letter that only prompts more questions than answers.
does not sound like Chris.
That's because it isn't, Claire. It just isn't. Point 7. Chief Irons tamed? I have to admit, the first time I saw the gameplay trailer of Claire and Shari encountering Chief Irons in the garage, I was really impressed by how they nailed his portrayal. In the remake, Irons is a twisted and corrupt motherfucker, much like his original counterpart, nailing everything down to the point of having the mayor's daughter on his dissection table, something that wasn't in the original but was implied. I was also really tense with goosebumps trying to hide from him as Shari, as no child would ever want to be in a situation like hers, and I will admit, I did like that reference to The Shining.
I'm coming in, Shari!
As brilliant as Irons is, for some odd reason, I can't help but feel he's been slightly tamed in the remake. Yes, he curses a lot, especially around a little girl, but then again, anyone can throw around bad words and not be a violent psychopath. In fact, that's pretty much my issue with Irons. His twisted acts are somewhat cut back. In the original, the first time you saw Irons, you knew something was definitely wrong, especially when he had the mayor's daughter dead on his desk, telling Claire how it went down, going as far as suggesting to decapitate her completely to prevent zombification, even though the bloody wound clearly shows she was shot, and his taxidermy addiction, or rather his hobby, didn't help either. His acts only intensified when he found his journal detailing how he planned and killed his own police officers and citizens, one of which he shot in the back of the head and enjoying the sight of the guy bleeding like as though it was a turn-on. You'd think I would make this up, but that was in the game. Even before meeting Irons, you get a glimpse of what he's all about from that fax from the FBI agent I mentioned, detailing how he received payments from Umbrella and getting away with rape in college just because he was a good student. In the remake, however, we only get a couple of writings from him, and his acts are scaled back compared to the original, despite knowing about the unspeakable acts in the orphanage, even going as far as to participate in them. There's also a taxidermy log where it's implied that Irons killed and stuffed a young woman, but only describing her as a pig, as well as how he barricaded a bunch of police officers. But that's about it in terms of his writing. As much as I liked Irons being implemented with the embryo and having his chest burst in reference to Alien, I felt like the scene should have been extended, much like how in the original he expressed his anger towards Umbrella for ruining his city with the virus, admitting to Claire he's with Umbrella. At least then you get a bit of humility from the guy instead of offing him too soon, which brings me to the next point. Point 8. Killing Ben off too soon. I have to admit, I really didn't like how little screen time Ben Bertolucci got in the remake. I felt that he should have lived longer to a certain point, but then again in the original game he didn't live that long either. I also noticed that his personality was completely different compared to his original counterparts, where he was just a stubborn prick who locked himself in the cell. That change doesn't bother me. Perhaps maybe he could have made it out of the cell with Leon facing all of those zombies and maybe have him killed off by Tyrant in the garage or something. The developers probably could have gone with a scrapped idea from Resident Evil 1.5 where another person would make it to the sewers with Leon and Ada but would wind up dead before the end of the campaign. I don't know, something to give more Ben some more attention. After all, he wasn't being rude to Leon this time around. Point 9. Not enough of Shari and ADA. While I'm on the subject of characters not having enough screen time, I wanted to bring up Shari and ADA, mainly when you take control of them. In the remake, you only play as them once, compared to the original where you played as them twice, although it was mostly to collect items for the other character and advance the story a bit. Instead of griping about how they could have been utilized more in the main game, this could be an opportunity for the developers to create new DLC for these two characters. I would really love to see a campaign with Shari on escaping her home being raided by zombies and going through some treacherous areas and tense moments throughout the city, to the point where she makes it to the police station and even then, she still doesn't feel safe. As for Ada, I could easily picture a campaign that takes place after she survives the deep plunge in an effort to escape the city her own way, while somehow obtaining the G-Virus sample, much like what Capcom did to her in the Umbrella Chronicles. I mean, they did that as well in Resident Evil 4 separate ways. Hell, for all we know, the development team could be working on such DLCs. But then again, considering that it's been more than half a year since we received DLC for this game, it could be unlikely, but things can come back and surprise us. It would be a better use of their resources and time than going after one person and threaten a lawsuit for listing one PlayStation 4 factory sealed copy of The Evil Within 2 on Amazon. Now that would be really embarrassing for a AAA game company, which by the way, actually did happen. And people ask why we didn't get DLC for that game. Point 10. No crows or spiders? For those of you that played the original Resident Evil 2, you will have no doubt noticed that pretty much every enemy has been recreated and brought into the remake with near flawless attention to detail, as well as adding a few new enemies to the mix. Hell, they even brought back the infected alligator, despite earlier rumors that it would be omitted. Sure, the encounter in the remake was short-lived, but then again, so was the original. Oh, I see Shari in the trash. Oh, big reptile come out of the water. I run, hit the switch, pipe drops, then reptile gets into the mouth, and boom, shoot, head dead, run. Yeah, now where's my daughter at? In the remake, oh, I go down water. Oh, big alligator comes up. Scary. Oh, I run. You almost get bitten 3 times. Then I slide down a bunch of crap. Then, oh, big reptile bites a pipe. I shoot pipe. Boom. Yeah, good. Dead. Gone. Good. Now, Ada, let's check into a motel and sleep together. However, 2 enemies were omitted from the remake entirely, which were the infected crows and the big-ass spiders. Now, I thought I would encounter the spiders in the sewer, but that wasn't the case. Same goes with crows, as they were nowhere to be found, not even outside, a place you would think infected crows would be. Sure, once in a while you'll hear crows cawing in certain moments, but according to the remake, they don't physically exist. While no official answer has been given for either of these omissions, I can only assume of 2 possible things for the crows. One being that the developers didn't want to encourage players to go crow hunting, since they are very smart birds and unlike the infected elephants, they never forget. This was probably to avoid controversy from animal advocates, but then again, every video game these days is subjected to controversy from obscure groups that no one ever heard of or will ever hear from again. The other possible theory would be that precision aiming on the infected crows might have been difficult for players, but that could possibly be remedied by an SMG or a shotgun for crowded attacks. Not to mention that they allowed Leon to kill birds in Resident Evil 4 with over-the-shoulder, but that's just me thinking out loud. As for the spiders, the only thing I could think of is that the developers couldn't find a proper place to use them. Who knows, maybe they could come back in a possible DLC? Maybe someday? I don't know. Point 11. Lack of examining environment. One of the things I love about classic and even some modern Resident Evil games is the submersion of your surroundings and things that pique your curiosity that you want to learn a bit more about, and that being examining objects. It's always interesting the things these games will tell you about objects that don't really have any use or purpose. In most Resident Evil games, you could pretty much examine every inanimate object that will tell you something completely different than what you looked at before. Sometimes these examinations could take a twist and trick the player into what they saw previously was just a ruse to get their brain sparking with a bit of concern. They also help players find key items that can be hidden in some of the most unexpected and ridiculous spots, and immediately afterwards, trouble will be triggered. Now, the Resident Evil 2 remake does have things to examine, but these are all objects you need to interact with for the use of key items or solving puzzles. Aside from 1 or 2 signs possibly, you will not find any object to examine that serves no purpose to the progression of the game. Phrases like nothing unusual here and doors locked on the other side does not exist. I played through the game 4 times recently on the PC version, and it's possible I may have overlooked something, but I couldn't find any inanimate object that had a random description. This is unusual given the amount of things you could examine in Resident Evil 7 that served no purpose, but they were there to define the setting of your surroundings. I could only guess that the developers couldn't implement these examinations due to time constraints, but there could have been other reasons such as improper use of resources or excessive writing taking up too much effort. My point is that without these elements of freestyle examination, there's very little reason to pick up on anything other than to admire the interior of the police station and Umbrella's nest. Point 12. Anticlimatic fight with Tyrant. I'll be perfectly honest, I really didn't like the final fight with Mr. X in the remake. Although his mutated form looked impressive, it feels sort of underwhelming compared to how he appeared in the original. Of course, I wasn't expecting his mutated form to look identical, but would it have killed them to add a couple more inches to his height? Now, depending on how good you are, the fight against Mr. X doesn't last very long, and of course, Ada drops the rocket launcher to you, which is the same one from the first Resident Evil game for some reason, even though the rocket launcher you unlock with infinite ammo has a completely different appearance. Anyways, the length of the original fight wasn't any better, but they did recreate it in Darkside Chronicles, and seeing Mr. X fight the way he did in that game, it makes me wonder why they couldn't recreate something similar to that. At least in Darkside Chronicles, he was more dangerous and very mobile. Of course, Mr. X is very dangerous in the remake, if it wasn't enough that he stalked you throughout nearly the entire game. I'm surprised that they didn't put him in the sewers. There is a chance for him to kill you instantly, but if you shoot him enough, you could prevent this. However, I can forgive all of this if it weren't for how the fight ended. In the original, it was badass when Leon uttered, "Game over," before firing a rocket towards Mr. X with different camera angles, much like in the first game. Hell, they did the same thing in the first remake with a chance of Tyrant deflecting the shot. In this remake, you just shoot the rocket at him, then abruptly cuts to his upper body being gone and falls to the ground dead. It's very anticlimactic compared to the previous final fights. I know that the development team were aiming for some more realism with this remake, but it would have been nice for that game over scene to be recreated in some form instead of just plainly shooting him dead and that's it. You know, talking about this now makes me very concerned as to whether or not Jill will be able to give Nemesis stars in the Resident Evil 3 remake with that awesome non-cheesy line.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Finally, we've come to the end of this Harkfest. There were a few more things I was considering griping about, such as the lack of lockpick and lighter, but I didn't see it as too big of a deal. And who knows, we might see both of them return in the next installment. I was really considering bringing up keeping intact the moment when Leon picks up Ada's gun to find that it wasn't loaded, as that would have been a pretty deep moment in the remake. I was hoping for a bit of an extended ending, but I imagine they'll bring the epilogues back for each character in the Resident Evil 3 remake, or at least that's what we can hope. I was also going to bring up the lack of extreme battle mode, but considering that we're most likely going to see Mercenaries mode in RE3 remake, I shouldn't really complain that much. Plus the content with the... Wait, what? Are you serious? Shit. Well, I hope Project Resistance will make up for it. If not, then... disappointing. Now, like I said at the beginning, all of what I griped about is just my opinion and should not be taken as offense or extremely serious. I don't feel it's worth creating a 40+ long reply thread to complain about, which might be inevitable for something unrelated to this video. Despite everything I talked about, this remake is amazing and I can't wait for the next one, and hopefully Capcom will consider a Code Veronica remake and bring back Outbreak. Who knows, they might be remaking Code Veronica as we speak. Fingers crossed that it's just as creepy or more creepy than the original. But until then, I will catch you all later. Thank you for tuning in.